I see the Lord, and His train fills the temple.
Welcome back to Private Conversations with Pastor Terry. And today we are going to be talking about the topic of deliverance. And we're going to be starting a whole new series. You're going to be teaching a really in-depth series on deliverance here
starting
at the
on
church.
Easter Sunday morning
Yeah.
in our teaching time, the class time before our service. I think at 9 o'clock, starting April 5th, we're going to be teaching on the ministry of deliverance. So it'll be an in-depth study of this subject, and we're going into things that a lot of people are not familiar with. So if you're interested in the ministry of deliverance, be sure and tune in on Sunday, starting April 5th, I believe it is, at 9 o'clock in the morning. It'll be broadcast live.
Yeah, awesome. And so that'll be about an hour long.
Yes.
Each Sunday, and so you'll be able to go into a lot more detail and provide a lot of the biblical background and everything.
Exactly.
So, well, to start off, why don't you tell us how you got into the ministry of deliverance? I mean, that's kind of
that's a whole series in itself right there. So
because not everybody gets into
this. They don't get it. Well, when I go out on the mission field, and usually when we go on the mission field, it's to teach deliverance to the churches. And then a lot of times people ask me, how did you get into this ministry? So this is a very interesting story. And so when I tell it, the people kind of get tickled about some parts of it. But the first time we ever did deliverance was, it was before we ever knew anything about this. And it was probably in the mid 80s, late 80s that happened. And actually it happened with my wife. And the story goes kind of like this, that the Lord was dealing with my wife and had her confess things to me. And she was confessing some things I didn't want to hear, but she did it anyway. And so as we were going through that, I would begin to pray for her. And one night we were praying, and something started manifesting in my wife, and I was like, oh my gosh. And she couldn't breathe. And I knew it was demonic, even though I had never done this before. And I said, in the name of Jesus, you come out of my wife. Don't you hurt her. Don't tear her. Come out quickly and quietly. And she blew her nose. And that's the way it came out. And it was like, good night, this is weird. So we went through a couple of weeks of deliverance. And just my wife and me, but we never told anybody, because at that time, there wasn't a lot of people doing this and not much information about it. And she's a Christian, I'm a Christian, and we're casting demons out of her, And so we'd never been taught that Christians could have demons. So that was a kind of a controversial subject, and it still is to some degree today.
Yeah.
So that was the first time, but we never did anything about that after that. We just kind of went our way and never pursued it until, a few years later, I began teaching Bible studies in homes, and we were doing this, and we were learning a lot, and we were even learning some things about deliverance in the scriptures, but not actually doing it. And
I remember my parents and I would go to your house a lot for Bible study when I was in high school.
We were doing the Bible studies, and so the Lord had taught me a lot through the scriptures, but I had never done anything with deliverance. And then a guy came to my study one time, and he said, well, I've heard about you, and he said, I really want you to pray for me for deliverance. And I said, I don't really know very much, at all. I've never really done any deliverance, but we were studying about it. And so he was a big guy, probably close to 300 pounds, and tall, and had a big beard, and he was pretty rough character. And he'd been to a lot of churches asking for deliverance because he was suicidal. He had COPD. He had all kinds of sickness, everything under the sun. He'd been in prison. And
we get that a lot here, where people are like, they're trying to find
help. And he would go to the churches and he'd say, well, I've got demons, I got voices. He said, and they said, are you saved? He said, yeah. He said, well, you can't have demons. He said, no, I got them. I know I got them. And so no one would help him, or could help him. And so they came, and So I remember we were having, so I had a couple of friends, a friend of mine and his wife, and we started praying for the guy, and I was on my knees on the floor and in front of the man, and he was sitting on the couch, and my wife was sitting in a chair, and my friend's wife was in a chair, and he was on the couch with him, and I started praying, and I was going like, oh Lord, please deliver this man, and blah, blah. I didn't know what I was doing. And all of a sudden, the man stands up and stands over me like this and begins to growl like a bear. And he goes, "Rawr," and I'm down on the floor, and he looked like he's 8 foot tall. And so I said, oh my gosh, I didn't know what to do. So all I could think of was I grabbed my Bible and I hit him in the chest with my Bible. Mm-hmm. I said, sit down in the name of Jesus. And he sat down, and I went, wow, this is so cool. I got the power, you know. And so I got down and did it again. I don't know why I did that, but I did it again. He comes up again, like that, and I said, well, it worked before, I'm going to do it again. Hit him in the chest. In the name of Jesus, sit down. Well, he didn't sit down. And he started coming at me. I went, oh my gosh. And my friend was sitting on the sofa, and he turned around, he pushed the sofa over all the way down, and it fell down against the back wall, and my friend was laying on his back, and he was over him like this, growling and trying to choke him. And my friend was going, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus, and nothing was happening. And so I thought, oh my gosh, he's going to kill him. That's what I thought. I thought he was going to actually kill him. So I grabbed him and pulled him off of my friend. He goes running through the house, and he's speaking in a demonic tongue, which I'd never heard. I'd never heard that before. First time I ever heard the demonic tongues. And so he was speaking in a demonic tongue, and I didn't know what to do, so I tackled him. I just dove at him, grabbed him around the legs, and he goes down on the floor. Mm-hmm. I'm in the floor, and I'm going, come out in the name of Jesus, come out in the name of Jesus. And my friend's wife comes, and she's the only one that had any brains. She brought the oil, you know. Mm-hmm. And everybody was praying in tongues and going kind of crazy. And we started anointing him with oil and began to cast the demons out. And they began to come out. And so that went on for a few weeks. Mm-hmm. And that was when we really first started it, is with that gentleman. Wow. And then for some reason after that, the word got out. Yeah. And then people started coming. Wow. And showing up, and I'm like, I didn't know what I was doing. Yeah. And the Lord took me through 6 years of training. Mm-hmm. And to go back a little further, years before that, the Lord had spoken to me in prayer one time, and he said, prepare the way of the Lord, my coming is near, 6 years of preparation. Those exact words he said. And I had no idea what he meant. I knew that preparing the way ministry was the John the Baptist ministry. Mm-hmm. And he said, my coming is near. I knew that no one knows the day of his coming, so I knew it wasn't about the second coming of the Lord, but I didn't know what it meant. Mm. And it was prepare the way of the Lord, and that's the John the Baptist ministry. So, and I remember saying, I don't want the John the Baptist ministry. You know, that's not very much fun. I want the Jesus ministry to cast out demons, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't want John's ministry. He lost his head, you know, and so I just left it at that. Yeah. And then, while I was in the middle of learning deliverance, it started when I was 51 years old. And I was about 53, 54 at the time. And I had a vision, and I saw the pages of a book, and they were blank. And I knew it was my book. And I said, you mean I have not done anything, Lord? After all these years, I've done nothing. It was blank. And it had the page numbers 51 and 56. Mm-hmm. And then the Lord spoke to me and told me what he had mentioned years back. Prepare the way of the Lord, my coming is near, 6 years of preparation. Yeah. So he interpreted that word to me, and he said, for 6 years, you're going to learn how to prepare the way of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And by preaching repentance, confession, renunciation, counseling legal rights, 6 years of preparation, and then when you prepare the way, then I will come. Wow. And so that's one of the reasons the name of our church is Preparing the Way, because if we prepare the way, properly through the John the Baptist type of ministry, then the Lord will come, He will show up, and He will heal, He will save, He will deliver.
Yeah.
But you need the John the Baptist ministry. So that's what I learned. So, and the 6 years was between the ages of 51 and 56. For those 6 years, I was on the job training, going all over the Dallas area and then into Mexico, different places. Mostly just privately doing things. I wasn't doing anything publicly, or even teaching it publicly, because I was learning.
Yeah.
So that was the 6 years of on-the-job training, learning about what deliverance was, and I went through things that I never imagined before. I mean, demons would start talking to me, and I never had that happen, never seen that before, and I learned how to interrogate them in certain situations to find out information so we could get to the roots of the issues and problems. And so it was that 6 year period where, and my wife primarily was with me. We had others that would come along the way and learn too. But that's how I learned the ministry of deliverance, and that's how God began to open a lot of the scriptures up to me through understanding deliverance. And so I had to understand how to get the demons out through the practical experience and also through the revelation of the Word. And through those two things combined is the way we began to learn. And so...
How would you say, like, when did it happen that you were studying the Word? Because I know you studied the Word a lot before this really started,
Absolutely.
right? And so was there a point when the Lord opened your eyes and you started seeing the demonic in the Word, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is here, but what do I do about it?
I'd seen that. I'd seen it in the Word long before.
Right.
I was doing it. And I really felt the call to go and do these things and preach about it. But I remember telling the Lord, I said, I can't go preach something I can't do. Even though I wanted to, but I said, I'm not going to preach something and talk about something and I don't know how to do it. And I said, when I learn how to do it, then I'll go out and I'll do it. I'll preach it, but I got to be able to do it. And so I learned, that the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, there were demons, it would refer to demons and all the different symbolism in the Bible, and I could see deliverance in the Bible, even the Old Testament. So I knew all of that part. So biblically, I had a pretty good basis for deliverance, but experientially, I didn't. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know about legal rights.
And was it through the parable of the sower and the seed that you initially kind of understood the Old Testament, or the symbolism?
that one there, I learned that the first time I heard that parable, I heard it from somebody, and that opened my eyes. And then from that, I was able to go and start understanding the other parables, and then that opened the door for the revelation that the Lord began to give me in Scripture. And then, along with the mission deliverance. When I started doing deliverance, that's when I really learned the Bible. I had a decent knowledge, but I did not have a working knowledge of Scripture until I started doing deliverance. And then scriptures that I had read for years and didn't understand, I began to understand. And this is what I teach this, and some people may disagree with me, but you're never really going to understand fully the scriptures until you understand deliverance, because a lot of the scriptures are connected to the ministry of deliverance. And I'll take an example. I've heard people teach it's on it's Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews 10, where it says, if you go on sinning willfully, there no longer remains a sacrifice for your sin. So I've heard people teach that in so many different ways, but I was praying for someone at one time, and this demon manifested in this lady. And I told the demon, okay, you have to come out in the name of Jesus. And the demon said, I'm not coming out. And I said, you have to, because it says here in the name. He said, I'm not coming out. I said, okay, well, I plead the blood of Jesus over you, because you hear those kind of cliches in Christianity, the blood, use the blood and all this. So I was trying out everything. I said, okay, I'll put the blood of Jesus on you, and now you come out. And then the demon said, well, the blood doesn't mean anything to me. And that really freaked me out. So now I'm having this...
It's like your whole Christian worldview is like, wait, what's happening here?
The whole theology that I've been taught, when I'm trying to apply it, it's not working. So this is one of the problems with a lot of people. People have a lot of head knowledge of things, but the practical application of it is totally different than just reading and claiming those scriptures. It doesn't work quite like that.
Yeah.
So when the demon told me that, I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? I don't know what to do. But the Lord brought, because I knew the word to some degree, the Lord brought to my mind that scripture. If you go on sinning willfully, there no longer remains a sacrifice for your sin, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fear of fire, which will consume the adversaries. So the demons are the judgment of God. They're there because of sins, and they execute the judgment. But if you sin willfully, there's no sacrifice. So what does that mean? That if you're willfully sinning, the blood of Jesus does not cover the sin, contrary to popular belief that teaches, well, the blood covers every sin. It does not cover every sin.
Well,
it only covers the sin that you confess and that you are not purposely, defiantly doing.
Yeah. And I think even in Leviticus 8, I was reading recently, it talks about how when they would come to offer a sacrifice for sin in the tabernacle, that if they had sinned unwillingly or unknowingly, then the Lord would forgive them. But even then, the Lord didn't honor the sacrifice for willful sin.
Yeah,
and so it's really just a mirror.
Yeah, it says in there, if you sin defiantly, there's no sacrifice.
Yeah.
So when I understood that scripture then, I really understood the scripture then. That's when I understood the revelation and meaning of that. And then so I knew that person was in some sin that they had not confessed. They were willingly doing it. So it was not covered by the blood. So the demon had legal rights. So this is what people don't understand many times about deliverance is it's a legal system.
Yeah.
And the demons are the judgment that is carried out on the sins. And if you don't remove the legal right for that judgment to be there, then the demons in the court case here that we have, they have the right to stay there. So I had to, in that case, I made the demon go down and asked the girl to come by, her spirit to come back up. She began to talk. I asked her, what are you doing? I think if I remember right, she was in heroin, doing drugs or something. Wow. Yeah. And when she confessed it, she asked for forgiveness and she repented. So that's the John the Baptist ministry.
Yeah.
That prepares the way. So that canceled or removed the legal right for that particular spirit to stay in there. So then when I called the demon back up, I said, does the blood mean anything to you now? And it was amazing. I mean, I was just really amazed at the authority, that you have in the name of Jesus, and when you understand the legal system. And the demon said, no, the blood, yes, I'm afraid of it, And I said, okay, the blood means something? Yes. And I said, okay, I'll put the blood on you, come out. And it came out.
Yeah.
So things like that we learned as we began to minister, and we learned that we had to remove the legal rights. And I remember going through this, and it would take me a long time to get the demons out because I'd have to find out what the roots were, find out what the sin was, do all this stuff. And I remember talking to the Lord about it. I said, Lord, you didn't do this. You just cast them out. But I'm here having to do all this stuff, find out what the sin was, find out what the root was, get them to forgive, get them to confess, get them to repent, all this stuff. It's taken a long time. Why do I got to do this? And he said, well, John the Baptist came first. He came before me. And so the people had already confessed. They had already repented. They had already asked for forgiveness. They had been under the ministry of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
So when Jesus came, he did not have to repeat the John the Baptist ministry. It had already been done.
Right.
So he was able to cast them out. So this is one of the problems today, that a reason that people do not get delivered is if you don't do the John the Baptist ministry, you will not in general be able to get people delivered from spirits or healed. Many times healing is connected to deliverance because if you don't get the demons out, the demons cause a lot of the sicknesses. So that's what we learned over the years. We saw people healed through deliverance, because a lot of times if you just pray for healing, it's not going to happen because there's a spirit behind the sickness or disease.
Yeah. And I think nowadays it's amazing how watered down the gospel has become. And really, honestly, a lot of churches are not preaching repentance and confession. And so there's no opportunity, if you will, for the deliverance ministry. And I remember one of my friends said years ago, like you typically get what you preach. Like if you preach healing, the Lord, that anointing tends to come. If you preach deliverance, if you preach repentance, you're going to see an outcome.
Yeah. You have to preach that. That's what the Lord had shown me years before we ever did this, was that prepare the way of the Lord, my coming is near. So if you prepare the way, He shows up. And in every case, there's always something that comes before the Lord. He says, before the great and terrible day of the Lord, I'm going to send Elijah the prophet, and then the Lord comes. He sent John, and then He came. So there's always someone or some ministry to prepare the way for the Lord to come. He just doesn't show up without a preparation, typically. It's like a president, when he goes somewhere, somebody goes in front of him, prepares the way, does the security, makes sure everything's in order, and then he comes. And the Lord kind of works the same way. So it's really, it was really an eye-opening experience for me. So this started about 30 years ago for me. And so we've been doing this about 30 years. It doesn't seem that long.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. We've seen, hundreds, thousands of people healed, delivered, set free. We do it every day, almost every day here in our church, on a regular basis. So that's kind of the way the ministry got started. And then after that 6-year preparation time, where I was doing pretty much everything in the private arena and homes and things like that, then the doors began to open for me to go out into the mission field, into churches, and start doing it publicly. And I always teach this, that like King David, you have to kill your lion and your bear privately before you kill Goliath publicly. So typically God prepares you kind of in the wilderness, in the private sector, before He will release you publicly, so you don't look stupid. And know what you're doing. So it took me 6 years, really intensive time, day and night, before I actually was able to go out and preach to churches and other pastors and congregations and do it where it's visible.
Was that period of training a lonely time?
Yeah, it was. It was to some degree. My wife and I did a lot of it by ourselves. People would come to our home, and we would go to people's houses. And then, as I was teaching in Bible studies, there were people that would come and go with me. And so we began to develop a little bit of a team of people that wanted to learn, and we would go to different places, and we would get calls, and we went all over Texas, and actually into Minnesota and other places as we were learning this. But initially, it was just a little bit of just a few people, and also most people didn't receive it very well. Churches, didn't want anything to do with it, for the most part. A lot more churches are open to it now in the U.S. Deliverance in general is more widely accepted, I think, in the Hispanic community in Central South America. Where we go, that's where we go in our mission trips. And so they receive it very well there. And there's not as much opposition to it, because I think the Hispanic people understand the spiritual arena a little better because of the witchcraft that's in these countries, and they've been exposed to witchcraft, so they understand it. But kind of Anglo-America doesn't quite get it, so it's a little harder to establish that ministry there. So that's why I'm in Oak Cliff, Mexico.
Well, it's amazing, after we were exposed to it and just seeing so many people set free, I remember growing up and some of my, kind of looking back, and, friends in high school or different people, they would hear sounds in their house, they would see spirits in their home, they would feel things, there'd be obvious torment, they're waking up with demonic dreams, or, and that's taboo, but so many people are going through that. I mean, I guarantee you somebody watching this right now is, has experienced or is experiencing things like that. And so I think finally people are just like, we need help.
I think a lot of times people have been afraid to say something because they're afraid people think they're crazy, or but I think now people are a lot more open about it, and it's a subject that's talked about more, especially with the movie that came out a couple of years ago about "Come Out in the Name of Jesus." That kind of opened the door for a little more dialogue about deliverance, and so it's more openly talked about today.
Yeah.
But it's still a lot of opposition against it because the devil doesn't want the people of God to know about it.
Yeah.
And I can just guarantee you, if you don't do deliverance, you don't preach deliverance, that the people in your church they're going to stay bound. The demons don't just pack up and leave because the preacher shows up. You know, they have to be dealt with, cast out, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
You know.
What would you say is the real reason why we need deliverance? Like what is the Lord going after? What's the outcome that He's seeking? Yeah,
well, in the parable of the sword and the seed, we see the birds of the air, they eat the seed, which is a word. And so if you have a lot of demonic things operating in your life, it's going to steal everything that you hear in church. They'll eat the word and twist it and confuse it for you. The demons prevent you from walking in righteousness. For instance, if you have a spirit of lust, it's going to keep you involved in pornography, maybe even the level of fornication and adultery, things like that. So it prevents you from walking in sanctification.
Yeah.
So
which prevents you from eternal
life. Yeah.
According to Romans 6.
According to Romans 6, obedience results in righteousness, righteousness sanctification, the outcome of sanctification is eternal life. Yeah. So the demons want to take you to. I've had them tell me.
Yeah.
We had a situation once down in Mexico. I think it was in Reynosa. I forget exactly where it was. Reynosa or Guatemala, somewhere. Guadalajara. And we had gone into this church, and I was ministering and preaching. And when I was preaching, I saw a young lady out there in the church, and the Lord spoke to me about her. And I brought her up on the platform. And I said, well, I really think the Lord has something for you. And I started praying for her. Well, when I did, the demons manifested. Mm-hmm. And I started casting the demons out. And they actually tried to kill her. They tried to choke her. Mm-hmm. They had it was really a tough deliverance. Mm-hmm. It was one of the toughest I've ever done.
Wow.
And she had gotten there by accident. She was looking for another church. She ended up in this church.
Wow.
And I called her out of the audience. And it was the Lord.
Amazing.
And it was just my wife and me. It was, we didn't have any help or anything. And we were praying for all these people. And so we were praying for her, and it went on for hours and hours. But the demons, I remember them telling me, we want to take her to hell. Mm-hmm. And she was Christian.
Yeah.
Our job is to take her to hell. We're going to take her to hell. Yeah. And we cast out a spirit of death, spirit of hell.
The grave.
The grave, death, hell, and the grave. You remember that story? Yeah. There were 3 spirits that manifested, and God showed me what they were, and we cast all death, hell, and the grave. We cast out of her, and they all tried. She turned blue,
I hate those moments when.
Like you want to.
I've seen.
You want to choke the devil out of them,
absolutely.
because the demons are so nasty. But she got delivered, and she looked totally different after that. But if you don't get the demons out, then they prevent you from walking in righteousness. They prevent you many times from the ministry God has for you. They'll torment you, and they'll turn you against God sometimes, and so deliverance is very important.
Oh, it sure is. Now, a lot of people have taught and have been taught that Christians can't have a demon because they're a Christian. And I think there's some arguments like, darkness and light can't dwell together. Some people say, how can Satan be in the presence of God, but he was in the book of Job? I mean, it's like, so we have this sort of misunderstanding, I think, a lot of times biblically. But I've heard you teach this, and so I know we could teach it for the next hour and a half. But briefly, what would you say to people that say or have been taught that Christians can't have a demon?
Well, the thing you have to look at is that there's a lot of Christian cliches that people throw around without looking at it biblically from all aspects of the theological base for it. For instance, people will say, well, a Christian can't have demons because darkness and light can't be in the same place at the same time. Okay, that's one of the things that people say. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and it was dark and void. He said, let there be light, and there was light. So now we got light. And then it says God separated the light from the darkness. So light and darkness were together in the beginning. So to say light and dark can't be together, well, it really was. But it's not supposed to be. That's the point is that it's not supposed to be, but it can be.
Yeah.
And it was in the beginning, and so what did God do? He separated it. So what do we do when we do deliverance? We separate the darkness from the light that's in the person. So that's just one example. The other, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the devil can't be in the same place at the same time. Well, when Job, the story of Job, Satan comes right there in the presence of God. He's standing in front of him with all the other angels. So he is in the same place at the same time with God, and he's there. You know, and so so he can be in the same place, and it's just like you can have a house, you own the house, but a thief can come in, and if you open the door and give him access, he can come in. He doesn't own the house, he doesn't possess the house, but he can occupy a part of the house. And so that's what demons do. They come in, they occupy a portion of this house. Be it the body, they can live in different parts of the body, the heart, you know. They manifest in different parts of the body because they live there. So they don't possess you. The word possession, I think, is a bad translation.
The Strong's Concordance actually, so a lot of translations will say demon possessed, but in the Greek it says vexed, like he was vexed or tormented by a demon. That's the literal Greek translation.
Yeah, or demonized, you know. So they're not out here, they're in here. But they don't own you, because if you belong to the Lord, He owns you. But they can occupy a part of the house. And when we teach on deliverance, we teach on the promised land, where Israel had to go into the promised land, and the enemy was already in the land. But God had given them the land, so they had to remove the enemies out of the land. And so when you're born with the sin, and generational iniquities, the demons follow the bloodlines and follow the iniquities. So the same thing today, just like possessing the land for Israel was kicking the Canaanite nations off, then we have to possess the land of the heart by kicking the demonic off. And so it's the same sort of thing. So the demons kind of come with the territory from generational things, and then as you go through life, they come in through your own personal sins against you, like molestation, rape, abuse, you know, abandonment, all kinds of things like that, where people have sinned against you. Opens the door for those spirits to come in. And so that's the way it works.
By the way, are you going to be teaching a lot on entry points of demonization and symptoms in the class? So
I will be.
You'll be talking a lot about, you know, molestation and how that can affect a person and how to be free. Right.
We'll be talking in detail, more detail about that, showing you biblically where it comes from and everything. So that's how we put the course together, based on the revelation that God's given me in the Word, and based on experience. You know, some things you when you're doing deliverance, some things you don't find in the Bible. It's not written down in Scripture. Do this, 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 and this, and the demon's going to come out. It doesn't tell you that. And it doesn't tell you the tools to use. It doesn't tell you the scriptures to use. It doesn't. You have to figure that out. And Jesus said, if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, the kingdom of God has come. So you have to follow the Spirit of God. And so you learn how to do this, and you learn tools and weapons and techniques as you get more experience. And it's just something God teaches you. So there's not a real formula. There's some basic principles that you follow. In general, most people that do deliverance will follow those principles. But when it comes down to the actual deliverance, it can be very weird sometimes and different.
Well, I think that's why it's so important to hear the Spirit of God, you know, to have the gift of prophecy operating, or you know, word of knowledge, so you can hear, okay, this is what's operating. Like a lot of times you'll just hear a word, and then you'll say it to the person or say it to the demon, and that triggers something, and it opens up, okay, here's really where the root is. This is where things got in, and we can understand. Then we can confess. Then we can repent, and get the things out. But without hearing the Lord, what do you do?
Well, I mean, we had a situation in Manzanillo once. It was a young girl. I think she was like 13. And we preached on deliverance. When you preach on deliverance, usually the demons manifest. It's just weird how that works. You can preach on anything else and they don't manifest. But when you preach on deliverance, all of a sudden they're manifest all over the place. So they were manifesting this girl, and she was screaming all over the place, and it was creating a really big disturbance. So we were all trying to do deliverance with other people. So I asked them to take her into this private room and work with her. And so as I was praying with somebody, the pastor came out, and she said, Pastor Terry, the demon's calling for you. This was really weird.
Oh, yeah.
You probably heard that story, right?
Yeah.
The demon said, well, Telly, I want to see you. And it was talking this trash. And so the demon wanted to see me. So I told her, tell the demon I'll be there in a little bit, So I finished up with some stuff. I went in there, and the demon was full manifested in the girl. Totally had control. And she was 13 years old. It had total control, talking nonstop. I never seen one like that. I couldn't get it to go down. I couldn't get it to obey. I couldn't get it. It would not do. I tried every scripture, every tool, everything I knew.
Yeah.
She had been molested by her grandfather. And but even that didn't, knowing that did not fix the problem. And I had no idea. And we had prayed for a solid hour with no impact at all. And it was about the first time I've ever wanted to give up on a deliverance. And I never have done that, but I was about ready to, because I didn't know what else to do. And then finally I heard the Spirit of God say, ask it what kind of demon it is. And I said this, are you a demon of the earth? Are you a demon of the wind, the air, or the demon of the water? And I just said those three, and why I said that, I don't know. It's just what came to me.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when you're doing deliverance, you say things and do things that you don't even know sometimes. Where did that come from? But you just do it. So I said that, and the demon said, none of those. I'm a demon of the fire. So it told me it was a demon of fire. And then, so when you're doing deliverance is spiritual, but it operates just like you would in the natural. Right. So you use the spiritual in the same way you would use the natural. So in the natural, if you want to put out a fire, what do? You put water on it.
Yeah. And
so that's the way it works many times. And so I just, by the Spirit, said, okay, in the name of Jesus, I asked for the water of the Holy Spirit to come and put out. And when I said that, the demon went crazy. It went totally crazy. And it came out and vomited up, and she got delivered just by that one thing. After one hour of praying everything I knew to pray. And it's like, where's that in the Bible? Well, you're not going to find that in the Bible. But the demons are the fire. He says the fiery judgment. So they are a fire sometimes. You have demons of fire. And so that's the way we did it. And you say, how do you know that? I don't know. It's just by the Spirit. And it worked.
We were on a mission trip kind of recently, a couple of years ago, I guess. And one of my friends asked me, he was on the trip with us, and it was his first time. And he was like, why does it take so long for the demons to come out sometimes? Or why do we have to keep saying stuff? And I'm listening to you praying for people, and why doesn't it just I thought they just came out whenever Jesus told them to? And I was like, well, actually, there's a scripture, it might be in Luke, but it literally says, and I think it was with the demoniac, one of the stories.
The one of the legions.
Yeah, he said he had been commanding him to come out. And I hadn't noticed that growing up, but it's even Jesus, in one instance, for whatever reason,
they didn't come out.
It didn't come out just right away.
It didn't,
And
it's just not. And also in the Bible, it says, they said come out and they came out. It doesn't tell you that necessarily they came out immediately. Sometimes it will, but sometimes that could have been an hour-long fight. It doesn't. They don't describe everything minute by minute. You know.
And even with Jesus, many times the demon would cast itself to the ground and do a bunch of manifestations before it came out.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. So it's the Bible doesn't explain all this in detail, and because it's just impossible to go through. It would take forever to write all this stuff down. All the things that I've seen, I could write, 1,000 pages, on that, on just the deliverances itself. So he doesn't go into those details. It's left up to the deliverance worker and the Spirit of God working with them. And that's why he says, if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God. So it's by the Spirit.
Yeah.
It's not a formula, although there are, like I said, basic things that you do need to know and that we can teach. But at some point, it's a matter of you, along with the Spirit of God and the Word of God, hearing and knowing how to go there. And many times you have to heal the person, sometimes the broken heart, the broken spirit, before you can get the demons to leave. So sometimes you cast the demons out and then you heal them. And then sometimes you heal them in the spirit and then cast the demons out. It just depends.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different ways that you can go with that. Yeah.
Wow. What would you say to someone who's watching this right now and they're hearing, you talk about this and they've got things going on, they've got issues and they feel maybe a sense of desperation or, they know that they need freedom and they haven't been able to find it yet. What would you say to give them hope right now?
Well, I think that if you really want to be free and you really pray, God will get you. He will either send somebody or send you to somebody, typically God hears your cry, and Israel cried out to God, and God sent Moses, and I know that a lot of times when we go to foreign countries and churches, I know that many of the people, because they tell me, we've been praying for this for years, and sometimes it doesn't happen right away for whatever reason. A lot of times it doesn't happen because the people that are supposed to be doing aren't doing it. And so God uses people, and so sometimes it's just nobody to do it, and sometimes that's why it takes a while. But God will send somebody, or if you really are serious, you'll find somebody. And we're here. We pray for people from different parts of the country, and people fly in sometimes from different places, and people come from other churches. Pastors sometimes send them. Sometimes they come on their own.
Yeah.
But if you seek the Lord, I think He'll guide you to the right place. And I think you need to make sure that you're careful that where you go, that they know what they're doing and that they understand the ministry. And it's more to it than just saying, "Come out in the name of Jesus." It's more to it than just the demons. It's really more about your heart. It's more about the person than it is about the demons. The demons are not the issue. It's typically a heart issue of some sort. So it's primarily dealing with the heart first, dealing with the issues, and then the demons are going to start leaving. Yeah. So it's a matter of you really seeking the Lord and wanting to follow God.
Yeah. And I know for myself and many other people, there have been times when the Lord has delivered me in my bedroom, just praying or really worshiping Him. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the repentance. And so if you have, you can do the John the Baptist ministry in your own life and just confess everything and repent. And I know that was even your experience before you got filled with the Holy Spirit. Trying to clean house and make sure that we've dealt with everything.
Right.
And then the Lord, then He can set us free.
Right. A lot, many times, after people maybe go through their first deliverance, which is usually the hardest one sometimes. After that, many people are able to just do self-deliverance, and you can do that, I'm not saying everybody does that, but there's a lot of people that do. We have people in our church that do their own deliverance. Sometimes they get into an area they need some help with, or they lack vision in a particular area, and they may need some help with that. But there is that self-deliverance that can happen.
I'm looking forward to getting into more the detail about deliverance and just really understanding the process and everything. So be sure to check out the class. It's going to be starting on April 5th. at 9 a.m. here at the church on Sundays. And Pastor Terry is going to be going really, really deep on deliverance and talking about symptoms and entry points and how to tell if something is demonic or not, and what the Word says, and just giving a lot of biblical basis for this. So if you're wanting to learn for yourself or to help other people, this is a really, really awesome place to start. It's going to be great. So be sure to join us next time.
Look forward to seeing you then.
Now my guilt is gone, and my sin has been forgiven.